The wind howled through the canyon like a wounded animal, carrying with it the dust of 1,000 dead dreams. High in the Sangre de Cristo mountains, where the eagles dared not nest and the snow lingered even in July, a lone figure moved through the shadows of towering pines. The year was 1882, and the West was dying, or being born, depending on which side of a rifle barrel you stood. Dakota had not spoken his Apache name aloud in 3 winters. To the few trappers who glimpsed him from afar, he was simply the ghost of the high country, a specter that vanished into mist before curious eyes could focus. His lodge, built of pine boughs and elk hide, nestled in a grove so remote that even the mountain lions avoided it, sensing perhaps the darkness that dwelt within its inhabitant. He had sworn his oath on a night when the stars themselves seemed to weep blood. Bike dahidi taldu, I will walk alone forever. The words had torn from his throat as he stood over the smoldering ruins of his people's camp, the acrid smoke of destruction filling his lungs. 23 souls, including his wife, Mourning Dove, and their 2 sons, had been reduced to memory and ash by the cavalry's dawn raid. They had been peaceful, had signed the papers, had believed the promises. The price of trust had been paid in full. Now, as the autumn sun cast long shadows through the aspens, Dakota moved with the fluid grace of one who had become part of the wilderness itself. His buckskin leggings, worn soft as butter, made no sound on the carpet of pine needles. The Winchester across his back was his only concession to the white man's world, a tool for survival, nothing more. His face, weathered by 35 summers, bore lines that spoke of laughter long forgotten and grief carved deep as canyon walls. The rabbit hung from his belt, its blood already congealed in the cold mountain air. It would feed him for 2 days if he was careful, 3 if he made soup with the bones. He had learned to live on less, to move through the world taking only what was needed, leaving no trace save for the whispers of those who claimed to have seen him, always at dusk, always alone, always vanishing like smoke. His lodge appeared through the trees, barely distinguishable from the natural lean of fallen timber and shadow. Dakota paused, as he always did, listening to the forest speak. A Steller's jay scolded from a nearby branch, its blue flash of feathers the only color in the gathering gloom. The creek murmured its endless story 50 yards to the east, running clear and cold from the snowmelt above. Inside the lodge, the air was thick with the smell of sage and old smoke. His few possessions lay in careful order: a parfleche bag containing pemmican and dried berries, a bone knife that had belonged to his grandfather, a cavalry pistol taken from a dead soldier, not in revenge, but necessity. Against the far wall, wrapped in oiled deerskin, rested the one item he could not bring himself to use or discard: Mourning Dove's wedding blanket, its intricate patterns speaking of a time when the future had seemed as bright as the designs woven into its fabric. Dakota built his fire with mechanical precision, each movement practiced thousands of times until it required no thought. The flames caught, casting dancing shadows on the lodge walls, and for a moment, just a moment, he could almost see her face in the patterns of light and dark. But he forced the vision away, as he always did. Memory was a luxury he could not afford, not if he wanted to keep his oath. The rabbit skinned easily under his practiced hands, the meat lean but sufficient. As he set it to roast over the coals, a wolf howled somewhere in the distance, its lonely call echoing off the canyon walls. Once, Dakota might have howled back, acknowledging the kinship of solitary hunters. Now he merely listened, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight like obsidian mirrors. The nights were the hardest. When the work of survival was done and the fire burned low, the ghosts came calling. Not supernatural spirits, but memories more haunting than any phantom. His son's laughter as he learned to string a bow, Mourning Dove's gentle hands braiding sweetgrass, the elders telling stories of when the Apache moved freely across the land like wind across grass. These visions were his penance and his prison, bars forged from love and loss in equal measure. He had tried, in the beginning, to die, had stood before charging bears, had walked into blizzards wearing nothing but a breechcloth, had drunk from streams he knew were poisoned by mine tailings. But the spirits, cruel in their mercy, had kept him alive. His body seemed to mock his death wish, growing stronger and more resilient with each passing season. He could track a deer across bare rock, could survive on plants that would poison a white man, could sense weather changes 2 days before they arrived. He had become what the old stories spoke of, a man caught between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, belonging to neither. The meat sizzled over the flames, its aroma filling the small space. Dakota ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Food was fuel, nothing more. The pleasures of flavor, like all pleasures, had been burned away with his family's bodies. He had become a creature of pure survival, existing rather than living, enduring rather than experiencing. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the lodge poles and sending sparks dancing up through the smoke hole. Winter was coming early this year. He could smell it on the air, feel it in the ache of old wounds. Soon the high passes would be blocked with snow, and even the most determined hunters would not venture this far into the mountains. For 6 months, he would be truly alone, with only the wind and the wolves for company. As he banked the fire for the night, Dakota allowed himself one ritual that bordered on the forbidden. From the parfleche bag, he withdrew a small wooden doll, no bigger than his thumb. He had carved it for his younger son's 3rd birthday, had never had the chance to give it to him. The wood was worn smooth now from handling, the features blurred but still recognizable as a tiny warrior, complete with a miniature bow that had long since broken off. He held it for exactly 10 breaths, no more, no less, then returned it to its hiding place. This was his only weakness, his sole concession to the man he had been before the world ended. Tomorrow he would wake before dawn, would hunt and gather and survive another day. He would keep his oath, would walk alone through the seasons until the spirits finally took pity and called him home. But tonight, as every night, he would dream of a lodge filled with laughter, of small hands reaching for his face, of a woman whose smile could chase away the darkest shadows. And he would wake, as he always did, to find only emptiness and the echo of his own breathing in the cold mountain air. The coals glowed red in the darkness, slowly fading like the last hopes of a dying people. Outside, the wolf howled again, and this time, despite himself. Dakota's throat tightened with an answering call he would not voice. He was the ghost of the high country, the last warrior of a scattered band, keeper of an oath that bound him more surely than any chain. He closed his eyes and waited for dawn, for another day of honoring his promise to live alone forever. Even as each sunrise took him further from the man he had been and closer to the shadow he had become. The afternoon sun hung low over the canyon, painting the rocks in shades of copper and gold. Dakota had been tracking elk since dawn, following their trail through the high meadows where the last wildflowers of autumn trembled in the breeze. It was then he saw it, a thin column of smoke rising from the valley below. Too dark and oily to be a campfire, too sustained to be natural. His first instinct was to turn away. The affairs of the white world were no concern of his. Let them burn their wagons and kill each other over gold claims and cattle rights. He had sworn to walk alone, and that meant turning his back on all humanity, regardless of their skin color or circumstance. But something in the smoke's desperate quality made him pause. It carried the scent of burning wood and leather. Yes, but also something else, the acrid smell of fear. Against his better judgment, Dakota descended the ridge, moving through the shadows like water flowing downhill. His moccasined feet found purchase on rocks that would have sent a booted man tumbling. As he drew closer, he could hear sounds carried on the wind, the distressed neighing of horses, the crack of splintering wood, and something that made his chest tighten despite his oath, a child's crying. The overturned wagon lay at the bottom of a steep ravine, one wheel still spinning lazily in the air. It had clearly taken the bend too fast, perhaps spooked by something on the trail. The horses were gone, either fled or stolen, their harness traces cut clean. Smoke poured from beneath the wagon bed where spilled lamp oil had ignited the dry grass. Dakota crouched behind a boulder, watching. His oath demanded he leave now, before he was seen, before he became entangled in whatever tragedy was unfolding below. But his eyes had already found them. A woman in a torn gray dress, her blonde hair unpinned and wild, trying desperately to lift a heavy beam that had fallen across the wagon's entrance. Beside her, a boy of perhaps 6 years stood frozen, his face streaked with tears and dirt. The woman's hands were bleeding from her efforts, leaving red smears on the wood. She was speaking to the child, her voice carrying despite the distance. "It's all right. Samuel, Mama's going to get us out. Just stand back. Sweetheart, stand back." But Dakota could see what she could not. The smoke was thickening, and flames were beginning to lick at the wagon's undercarriage. In minutes, the entire structure would be ablaze. The woman pulled at the beam again, her movements growing more frantic, more futile. The child saw him first. The boy's eyes, blue as a winter sky, locked onto Dakota's position with the instinctive awareness of the young. He tugged at his mother's skirts, pointing, his mouth forming silent words. The woman turned, and Dakota found himself looking into a face marked by grief and determination in equal measure. She did not scream, as he expected. Instead, she straightened slowly, placing herself between her child and the stranger, her chin lifting with a dignity that transcended her desperate circumstances. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, they regarded each other across the gulf of two worlds. Her eyes held no plea, no expectation, only the resigned courage of someone who had already lost too much to fear losing more. It was that look, more than the child's tears or the spreading flames, that moved Dakota from his hiding place. He approached slowly, hands visible, his movements deliberately unthreatening. The woman watched him come, her body tense as a drawn bow. When he was close enough to see the freckles across her nose, the purple shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, he stopped. "Back away," he said, his voice rough from disuse, the English words feeling foreign on his tongue. She hesitated only a moment before pulling her son back. Dakota examined the beam, a main support from the wagon's frame, far too heavy for one person to lift. The smoke was getting thicker, stinging his eyes. Without speaking, he positioned himself at one end and began to lift, muscles straining against the weight. The wood groaned but began to move. "The other end," he grunted. "When I lift, you pull." The woman didn't waste time with questions. She grabbed the beam's opposite end, and together they managed to shift it enough to clear the entrance. Dakota immediately dropped to his knees, peering into the smoke-filled interior. Scattered belongings, a shattered trunk, bolts of fabric, the contents of a life in transit. "Is there anyone else?" he asked. "No." Her voice was steady despite the circumstances. "Just us." The fire was spreading faster now, fed by the dry wood and years of oil soaked into the wagon bed. Dakota grabbed what he could reach, a canvas bag, a water barrel that had miraculously remained intact, a wooden box that rattled with unknown contents. The woman worked beside him, efficient despite her obvious exhaustion, saving what could be saved while the flames grew higher. When the heat became too intense, they retreated up the slope. The boy clutched in his mother's arms. From a safe distance, they watched the wagon consumed, reduced to a skeleton of blackened wood and twisted metal. The woman set her son down carefully, checking him for injuries with gentle hands before turning to face Dakota. "Thank you," she said simply. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25 winters. Her dress, though torn and dirty, was well made, the fabric fine. A gold band glinted on her left hand. Her accent held traces of somewhere east, not the drawl of Texas or the twang of Missouri, but something softer, more refined. "You're injured," Dakota observed, nodding at her bloodied hands. She glanced down as if surprised. "It's nothing," but he could see how her hands trembled, how she swayed slightly on her feet. The boy, Samuel, she had called him, clung to her skirts, his eyes never leaving Dakota's face. The child had his mother's delicate features but darker hair, almost black. His clothes were those of a town child, proper boots, wool trousers, a jacket with brass buttons. "Where were you heading?" Dakota asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Cedar Ridge," she replied. "My husband's brother has a store there. Had a store." She corrected herself, her voice catching slightly. "I received word that there was fever by the time my letter arrived, asking him to send someone to meet us." She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Dakota had seen the fever that swept through the frontier towns, taking the weak and strong alike. He'd also noticed her use of the past tense regarding her husband, a widow, then trying to reach family that might no longer exist. The sun was sinking lower, and already the canyon was filling with purple shadows. Night came quickly in the mountains, and with it, cold that could kill as surely as any flame. Dakota found himself at a crossroads, the oath pulling him one way, basic humanity another. "You can't stay here," he heard himself saying. "Wolves, bears, and the men who cut your horses loose might return." The woman's hand moved instinctively to her son's shoulder. "We'll manage." "With what?" Dakota gestured at their meager salvaged possessions. "No shelter, no food. Your hands need tending before they fester." She met his gaze steadily. "And what would you have us do?" The question hung between them like morning mist. Dakota could feel the weight of his oath, 3 years of solitude pressing down on him like stones. But he could also see the child shivering despite his mother's attempts to shield him from the wind, could see the woman's stubborn pride warring with the reality of their situation. "My camp isn't far," he said finally, the words tasting of betrayal and necessity in equal measure. "You can rest there tonight. In the morning, I'll show you the trail to Cedar Ridge." The woman studied his face, searching for something, truth, perhaps, or treachery. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, for she nodded once. "My name is Margaret Connor," she said formally. "This is my son, Samuel." Dakota didn't offer his name in return. Names were for people who existed in the world, who had connections and futures. He was merely a ghost offering temporary shelter to the living. As he led them up the mountainside, the boy's small hand found its way into his mother's, and Dakota tried not to remember other small hands, other twilight journeys. Behind them, the last of the wagon collapsed in a shower of sparks, sending their shadows dancing across the rocks like spirits fleeing the dying light. The lodge seemed smaller with 3 souls inside it. Margaret Connor sat near the fire, her son pressed against her side, both of them trying not to stare at their surroundings. Dakota could see them taking in the elk-hide walls, the weapons hung with careful precision, the sparse but efficient arrangement of his possessions. To town-bred eyes, it must have seemed as foreign as the moon. He worked in silence, grinding willow bark and sage into a paste for Margaret's hands. She watched him warily, like a deer ready to bolt, but when he gestured for her to extend her palms, she complied. The boy, Samuel, observed everything with the intense focus of a child trying to understand a world that had suddenly become unpredictable. "It will sting," Dakota warned, applying the mixture to her torn skin. She didn't flinch, though he saw her jaw tighten. "I felt worse," she said quietly. As he wrapped her hands in clean strips of soft buckskin, she asked, Do you live here alone?" The question hung in the smoke-scented air. Dakota nodded once, curtly, hoping to discourage further inquiry. But Margaret Connor, he was learning, was not easily discouraged. "For how long?" 3 winters. "That's a long time to be alone." He didn't respond, focusing instead on securing the bandages. Her hands were smaller than Mourning Dove's had been, the fingers more delicate, unused to hard labor. Yet there were calluses on her right palm that spoke of recent struggles, perhaps from holding reins on the long journey west, or from gripping the handle of a coffin as it was lowered into foreign ground. Samuel had crept closer, fascinated by the bone knife at Dakota's belt. The boy's eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but curiosity was winning over fear. Dakota remembered that age, when the world was still full of wonders despite its dangers. Without thinking, he pulled a piece of dried venison from his stores and offered it to the child. Samuel looked to his mother for permission. At her nod, he took it carefully, as if accepting food from a wild animal that might bite. The first tentative chew led to another, hunger overcoming hesitation. "Thank you," Margaret said. "He hasn't eaten since yesterday morning. We were trying to make good time, to reach Cedar Ridge before—" She trailed off, lost in whatever had driven them to take risks with mountain roads. Dakota prepared a simple meal. More venison, some late berries he'd gathered that morning, pine needle tea that would help ward off the cold. They ate in relative silence, broken only by the crack of the fire and the wind testing the lodge poles. The awkwardness was palpable. 3 strangers thrown together by circumstance, none quite sure how to navigate the forced intimacy. As darkness deepened outside, Samuel's eyelids began to droop. Margaret fashioned a bed for him from their salvaged blankets near the fire, singing softly, a lullaby about mockingbirds and diamond rings that seemed achingly out of place in the primitive shelter. The boy fought sleep, still watching Dakota with those startling blue eyes, but eventually exhaustion won. Once her son slept, Margaret's careful composure began to crack. She sat staring into the fire, her bandaged hands folded in her lap, and Dakota saw the weight she'd been carrying settle more visibly on her shoulders. "My husband died 6 weeks ago," she said suddenly, as if the words had been pressing against her teeth. "Pneumonia. He was a good man, a clerk for the mining company. Never raised a hand to us, never drank more than was proper. We were going to save enough to buy a little shop back east, somewhere safe for Samuel to grow up." Dakota added wood to the fire, letting her speak. Then the fever came. Thomas was strong, but— She shook her head. "The company gave me 2 weeks to vacate our quarters, 2 weeks to bury my husband and decide where a widow with a child might go. His brother in Cedar Ridge was our only family west of the Mississippi. And now I don't know if he's alive or dead, if the fever reached Cedar Ridge too." She glanced at Samuel's sleeping form. "I have $43 sewn into my corset and whatever skills a finishing school in Baltimore thought proper for a young lady to possess. Embroidery and French conversation don't seem particularly useful out here." Despite himself, Dakota felt a twist of sympathy. He'd seen too many Eastern women ground down by the frontier, their gentle upbringings poor preparation for the harsh realities of Western life. This one, though, had steel beneath her proper manners. She'd fought to save what she could from the burning wagon, had kept her son calm through terror, had accepted help from a strange Apache man without hysteria. "You could go back," he suggested. "To Baltimore. With what money, and to what?" She smiled bitterly. "My parents disowned me when I married Thomas. He was beneath our station, they said, a clerk with no prospects. They were right about the prospects, I suppose." The fire popped, sending sparks up through the smoke hole. Outside, an owl called, its haunting note echoing off the canyon walls. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I'm sorry," she said abruptly. "You don't need to hear my troubles. You've done more than enough, and we'll be gone in the morning." Dakota studied her profile in the firelight, the determined set of her chin, the way she held herself despite everything. He thought of the trail to Cedar Ridge, treacherous even in good weather, nearly impassable with a child and no supplies. He thought of the men who had cut her horses loose, who might be watching the trails for easy prey. He thought of his oath. "The morning will bring rain," he said finally. "The trail will be mud. You should wait." She turned to look at him fully then, and he saw she understood this was not about weather. "We can't impose. One day," he said firmly. "Rest. Let your hands heal. I'll scout the trail, make sure it's clear." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why help us?" The question cut deeper than she could know. Dakota looked away, into the darkest corners of the lodge where firelight couldn't reach. "Because I once had a son who liked to watch everything," he said, the words scraping his throat raw. "And because the dead can't use kindness, but the living still can." She seemed to understand that this admission had cost him something precious. "What was his name?" "Little Wolf. He would have been about your boy's age." The silence that followed was different than before, not awkward but full. like the pause between lightning and thunder. Margaret reached out as if to touch his arm, then thought better of it, her hand dropping to her lap. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said simply. Dakota nodded, unable to trust his voice. He rose abruptly, checking the door flap, the fire, anything to escape the unexpected intimacy of shared grief, when he finally settled onto his own blankets, far from the fire and his guests. He could feel Margaret's eyes on him in the darkness. "What should I call you?" she asked quietly. He was quiet so long she probably thought he wouldn't answer. "Finally," he said, "Dakota. It means friend to everyone." The irony of it twisted in his chest. Though that was before. "Dakota," she repeated, testing the unfamiliar syllables. "Thank you. Dakota." He closed his eyes, feigning sleep. But behind his lids he saw not the familiar ghosts of his past, but new images. A woman fighting to save her child. A boy's wondering eyes. Hands that bled from trying to lift what couldn't be lifted alone. For the first time in 3 years, the silence in his lodge didn't feel like peace. It felt like the held breath before a storm. Outside, the owl called again, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf answered. The sound raised the hair on his neck, not from fear, but from recognition. The wolves were hunting in pairs tonight, their calls speaking of coordinated pursuit, of shared purpose. Even the predators of the mountains knew that some burdens were too great to bear alone. Margaret's breathing had evened out, exhaustion finally claiming her. But Dakota lay awake, staring at the smoke hole where stars glittered like scattered dreams, wondering how a single afternoon had cracked the walls he'd built so carefully around his heart. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would send them on their way. Tomorrow, he would return to his oath, his solitude, his penance. But tonight, for the first time since he'd made his vow, the lodge didn't echo with emptiness. It held the soft breathing of a sleeping child, the presence of a woman who'd lost everything but kept walking, the faint scent of lavender that must have somehow survived in the folds of her dress. It held life, unwanted and uninvited but undeniably present, and Dakota found himself both grateful and terrified of what the morning might bring. The days blurred into one another like watercolors in rain. What was meant to be one night became 3, then a week, as autumn storms lashed the mountains with unseasonable fury. The trail to Cedar Ridge transformed into a rushing torrent, impassable and deadly. Each morning, Dakota would check the paths and return shaking his head. And each morning, Margaret would nod with what he suspected was relief rather than disappointment. They fell into an unexpected rhythm. Margaret proved herself useful despite her city upbringing, learning to tend the fire without being asked, to prepare the simple meals he taught her. Her hands healed quickly, leaving only faint scars that she would study sometimes when she thought no one was watching. Samuel, freed from the constraints of proper behavior, became a different child, curious, eager, following Dakota like a small shadow. "Why do you walk so quiet?" the boy asked one afternoon, watching as Dakota moved through the lodge. "The earth is our grandmother." Dakota found himself explaining, the words coming from a place he'd thought sealed forever. "Would you stomp on your grandmother?" Samuel giggled, then tried to imitate Dakota's steps, his small boots clumsy but determined. Margaret watched from her place by the fire, her expression unreadable. It was she who surprised him most. He'd expected helplessness, complaints, the fragile sensibilities of an Eastern lady. Instead, she adapted with quiet determination. When he showed her which plants could be eaten, she memorized them with the focused intensity of someone who had learned that knowledge meant survival. She mended their torn clothes with tiny, perfect stitches that transformed rags into something respectable. She even attempted to learn a few words of Apache, though her pronunciation made him wince. "Goche," she tried one evening, holding up the water gourd. "Two," he corrected gently. "Goche means rope." She laughed then, a sound like creek water over stones, and for a moment, the lodge felt dangerously warm. The danger lay in these moments of forgetting. When Samuel fell asleep in Dakota's lap while listening to a story about Coyote and the stars. When Margaret hummed while working, filling the space with melodies that spoke of distant drawing rooms and garden parties. When their eyes met across the fire and held a beat too long before looking away. One night, the storm particularly fierce. Samuel woke crying from nightmares. Margaret tried to comfort him, but the boy reached for Dakota, speaking through his tears. "The bad men might come, like they did for Papa." Margaret's face went white in the firelight. She hadn't spoken of how her husband died, and Dakota hadn't asked. Now, holding the trembling child, he looked at her with a question in his eyes. "It wasn't pneumonia," she said quietly. "Not entirely. There was a dispute at the mine. Thomas discovered discrepancies in the books, money disappearing, wages unpaid. He was going to report it to the authorities in Denver." She swallowed hard. "He fell ill very suddenly. The doctor said pneumonia, but you don't believe it." Thomas was careful. He knew they were dangerous men. He'd started teaching me to shoot, just in case. Her laugh was bitter. "I never thought I'd need to know." Dakota felt the familiar anger stir in his chest, the rage against men who took what wasn't theirs, who destroyed lives for gold and power. It was safer than the other feeling growing stronger each day, the desire to protect these two souls who had stumbled into his carefully ordered isolation. As the weeks passed, the boundaries he'd maintained began to dissolve. He taught Samuel to set simple snares, to read tracks in the mud, to whistle like different birds. The boy absorbed everything with an enthusiasm that was both heartbreaking and healing. Margaret learned to skin rabbits without flinching, to bank a fire so it would last the night, to move through the forest with something approaching grace. And at night, when Samuel slept, they would talk. "I was 17 when I met Thomas," she told him one evening. "At a church social. He was so serious, so determined to make something of himself. My parents were horrified. They'd intended me for a banker's son, someone with established wealth. But you chose him anyway." "I chose love," she said simply. "And I'd choose it again, even knowing how it would end." Those years of happiness were worth more than a lifetime of comfort without feeling. Dakota understood too well. He found himself sharing more than he'd intended. Stories of Mourning Dove, their courtship, the joy of watching their children grow. Margaret listened without judgment, without the platitudes white people usually offered when confronted with Indian grief. "You're not what I expected," she admitted one night. "When I was young, they told us stories, terrible stories about Apache warriors. Some were true." Dakota said honestly, "We were not always gentle, but neither were those who came to take our land." "No," she agreed. "They weren't." The moment that changed everything came on a night when the first snow began to fall. Samuel had been restless all day, hot to the touch, and by evening he was burning with fever. Margaret tried to hide her panic, but Dakota saw the terror in her eyes, the memory of another fever, another loss. He worked through the night, preparing teas from willow bark and wild chamomile, cooling the boy's fever with snowmelt and prayers he hadn't spoken in 3 years. Margaret never left her son's side, singing softly, whispering promises that everything would be well. When Samuel's breathing grew labored, she looked at Dakota with eyes that begged for a miracle he wasn't sure he could provide. "Please," she whispered, and in that word was every prayer she knew. Dakota did something he'd sworn never to do again. He sang a healing song his grandfather had taught him, calling on spirits he'd turned his back on when his own children died. His voice, rusty from disuse, rose and fell with the ancient melody. Margaret watched, tears streaming down her face, as he painted symbols on Samuel's forehead with the ochre and ash. The fever broke near dawn. Samuel's breathing eased, his skin cooled, and he fell into a true sleep. Margaret collapsed against Dakota's shoulder, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. Without thinking, his arms came around her, holding her as she shook. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you." They stayed that way as the sun rose, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. And when she lifted her face to his, when their eyes met and held, when she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, soft, grateful, alive. Dakota felt his oath shatter like ice in spring. The kiss was brief, barely more than a breath, but it shook him to his core. Margaret stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth, color flooding her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she began, but he shook his head. "Don't," he said roughly. "Just don't." She nodded, understanding that apologies would make it worse, would acknowledge what they both felt growing between them like a vine through stone. They turned to watch Samuel sleep. The crisis passed, and pretended the world hadn't just shifted on its axis, but the damage was done. The walls Dakota had built so carefully, brick by brick from grief and rage and isolation, had crumbled at the touch of her lips. In their place was something terrifying and wonderful and impossible. Hope. And with hope came fear, because he knew what it meant to lose everything, and he wasn't sure he could survive it twice. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, covering the old paths and creating new ones. Inside the lodge, 3 souls huddled together against the cold, bound now by more than circumstance, more than survival. They were becoming something Dakota had sworn never to be again, a family. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The peace shattered like a gunshot through morning mist. Dakota had been tracking deer in the lower valley when he saw them, 5 riders picking their way up the mountain trail, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. Even from a distance, he could see the rifles across their saddles, the determined set of their shoulders. These weren't lost travelers or traders. They moved with the purposeful rhythm of men on a hunt. He ran, through snow-laden pines, across frozen streams, up paths that would have winded a younger man. His lungs burned with the effort, but fear drove him faster than he'd moved in years. By the time he reached the ridge above his lodge, the riders were already in the clearing below. Margaret stood in front of the entrance, Samuel behind her skirts, facing the men with her chin raised. Even from his vantage point, Dakota could see her hands trembling, though her voice carried clear and steady. "I told you, I don't know what you're talking about. My son and I were traveling to Cedar Ridge when our wagon overturned. That's all." The lead rider, a thick-set man with graying whiskers, spat tobacco juice into the snow. "Now, Mrs. Connor, let's not play games. Folks in Cedar Ridge saw smoke from up here. They know about the Apache who haunts these mountains. You expect us to believe you and the boy survived alone all these weeks?" "Believe what you will," Margaret replied. "We've been sheltering in a cave, waiting for the weather to clear." Another rider, younger with a scarred face, laughed unpleasantly. "A cave," she says. "Then you won't mind us having a look around. Will you? Make sure you haven't been corrupted by savage company." Dakota's hand moved to his rifle, but he forced himself to stillness. 5 armed men, experienced fighters by their look, in his younger days, with warriors at his side. It would have been a fair fight. Now, alone, he'd be dead before he could take down more than 2. And then what would happen to Margaret and Samuel? The leader dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. "Here's what I think. Ma'am, I think that Apache found you, and you've been living in sin with him, trading your virtue for protection. It's understandable. A weak woman alone needs help, but it's our Christian duty to save you from such degradation." Margaret's voice turned to ice. "How dare you!" "And then there's the matter of your late husband's effects." The man continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "The mining company is very interested in recovering certain documents, papers that went missing from his office the night he died, papers that might be worth quite a bit to the right people." So that was it. Dakota understood now. These weren't just prejudiced townsmen, but hired guns, sent to tie up loose ends. Margaret must have taken more than memories when she fled. "I don't know about any papers," Margaret said, but her voice betrayed her with the slightest waver. The scarred man dismounted as well, approaching her with deliberate menace. "Maybe we need to search more thoroughly. Check all your hiding places." When he reached for her, Samuel burst from behind her skirts, kicking at the man's shins. "Leave my mama alone." The man backhanded the boy casually, sending him sprawling into the snow. Margaret screamed, dropping to her knees beside her son. And in that moment, Dakota's careful control snapped. He came down the slope like an avalanche, silent until the moment his rifle butt connected with the scarred man's skull. The man dropped, and Dakota spun, bringing the weapon up to cover the others. "Touch them again and die," he said simply. The remaining 4 men went for their guns, but Dakota had already moved, using the scarred man's body as a shield. A shot rang out, then another. Snow exploded near his head as he rolled behind a fallen log, Margaret's screams mixing with the crack of gunfire. The leader's voice rang out, "It's him, the Apache! Get to cover!" What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse. Dakota used every trick learned in a lifetime of warfare, moving through his own territory like smoke. He wounded one man with a shot to the shoulder, sent another tumbling down the slope with a well-placed rock, but they were spreading out, trying to flank him, and he couldn't be everywhere at once. It was Samuel who changed everything. The boy, blood trickling from his split lip, grabbed a burning branch from the outdoor fire pit and flung it at the horses. The animals, already skittish from gunfire, bolted in panic, taking with them the extra ammunition and supplies. "You little brat!" One of the men turned his rifle toward the boy. Dakota didn't remember crossing the distance. One moment he was behind the log, the next he was on the man, his grandfather's bone knife finding the soft spot between ribs. They went down together, rolling in the bloody snow, as another shot cracked overhead. "Stop!" Margaret's voice cut through the chaos. She stood with the scarred man's dropped pistol in her hands, aimed at the leader. "Enough! Call off your men or I'll shoot!" The leader laughed. "You won't shoot, woman. You don't have it in you." Margaret's eyes were cold as winter stars. "My husband thought he was safe too. Right until the end." Something in her tone made the man pause. Dakota used the distraction to regain his feet, his rifle trained on the wounded gunman who was trying to crawl toward his weapon. "Here's what's going to happen," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You're going to take your wounded and leave. You're going to tell whoever sent you that we died in the wagon fire, that there were no survivors, no papers, nothing. And if we don't, then I'll give these papers to the federal marshal in Denver. Every transaction, every bribe, every murder disguised as an accident." "My husband was very thorough." The leader's face darkened. "You're bluffing." Margaret smiled, a cold expression that transformed her delicate features. "Samuel, sweetling, remember the song Mama taught you about the safe place?" The boy, still on the ground but alert, began to sing in a shaky voice. "In the old oak tree, where the ravens nest, 30 paces north, then 10 toward the west." "That's enough, darling," Margaret said, never lowering the gun. "You see, Mr. Hartley," the man growled. "Mr. Hartley, even if you kill us all, you'll never find where I've hidden them. But federal investigators, with time and patience, they might—" The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Dakota could feel the wounded men weakening, could see the calculation in Hartley's eyes. 3 men down, horses scattered, the threat of exposure. Not good odds for anyone. "Finally," Hartley spat again. "Get the wounded mounted. We're leaving." It took time to catch the horses, to load the groaning men. Dakota never lowered his rifle. Margaret never wavered with the pistol. Only when the riders had disappeared down the trail did she finally let the weapon fall, her whole body beginning to shake. "Are they gone?" Samuel whispered. Dakota gathered them both into his arms, feeling their hearts race against his chest. "For now," he said, "but they'll be back, with more men." Margaret looked up at him, tears cutting tracks through the dirt and gunpowder on her face. "I'm sorry. I should have told you about the papers. I thought if no one knew—" "You protected your son," Dakota said. "There's no shame in that." They retreated to the lodge, barricading the entrance, tending Samuel's split lip. and the graze on Dakota's arm where a bullet had found its mark. As Margaret cleaned the wound, her fingers gentle but sure, she asked, "What do we do now?" Dakota looked at the two of them, this woman who had kissed him back to life, this boy who had found courage in the face of violence. His lodge, his sanctuary for 3 years, was no longer safe. The oath that had defined him was already broken. What remained was a choice: return to isolation and let them face their fate alone, or embrace what they had already become to him. "We run," he said finally. "Together, west, into the deep mountains where they won't follow. There are places even I haven't explored, valleys hidden from white men's maps. And then," he touched her face, thumb brushing away a tear, "then we live, not alone, not anymore, if you'll have me." Margaret's answer was in her kiss, fierce and desperate and full of promise. When they broke apart, Samuel tugged at Dakota's sleeve. "Does this mean you're my papa now?" the boy asked with the directness of childhood. Dakota looked at Margaret, who nodded through her tears. "If you'll have me," he repeated. Samuel considered this with 6-year-old gravity. "Can you teach me to throw a knife like you did?" Despite everything. Dakota laughed, the first real laugh in 3 years, among other things. Outside, night was falling, bringing with it the promise of snow and pursuit and danger. But inside the lodge, as they prepared for the journey ahead, Dakota felt something he'd thought lost forever, the fierce joy of having something worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. The ghosts of his past would always be with him, but now they had company, the living, breathing future wrapped in a woman's courage and a child's trust. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight they were together, and that, he realized, was everything. They traveled by night, when the moon turned the snow-covered peaks into a landscape of silver and shadow. Dakota led them through passes he'd discovered in his years of solitude, paths so narrow that sometimes they had to press their backs against cold stone while their feet sought purchase on ledges no wider than a child's hand. Samuel, strapped to Dakota's back in a makeshift carrier, stayed remarkably quiet, as if he understood that their lives depended on silence. Margaret followed without complaint, though Dakota could see the exhaustion etched in every line of her body. Her boots, made for city streets and carriage rides, were falling apart. Her dress, even reinforced with strips of hide, caught on every branch and rock. Yet she pressed on, driven by the same force that had kept her standing when those men threatened her son, pure, unwavering determination. On the 3rd night, they heard the dogs. The baying echoed off the canyon walls, still distant but unmistakably pursuing. Dakota's heart sank. Dogs meant experienced trackers, men who knew these mountains almost as well as he did. They'd been careful to walk in streams when possible, to double back on their own trail. But dogs would follow scent over stone and through water. "How far?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. "A day, maybe less." Dakota scanned the terrain ahead. They were entering a box canyon, high walls on either side, only one way in or out. It was shelter from the wind, but also a potential trap. "We need to move faster. I can't," Margaret started, then stopped herself. Yes, I can." They pushed harder, climbing until their lungs burned in the thin air. Samuel whimpered occasionally, but didn't cry out. His small hands clutched in Dakota's hair. Dawn was breaking, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold, when they finally reached the end of the canyon. Before them lay a sight that stopped even Dakota's breath, a hidden valley, protected by towering cliffs on all sides, accessible only through the narrow passage they'd just traversed. A hot spring steamed in the center, keeping the temperature mild enough that grass still showed green beneath patchy snow. Ancient ruins dotted the far wall, the remains of cliff dwellings built by people long vanished. "The old ones," Dakota breathed. His grandmother had told stories of such places, sacred valleys hidden from the world, but he'd thought them legends. Margaret sank to her knees, overwhelmed. "It's beautiful." They made camp in one of the more intact ruins, a stone structure that still had most of its roof. The hot spring provided warmth and water, and Dakota found evidence of an old garden plot where hardy plants had continued to grow wild. It was everything they needed to survive. Shelter, water, even food if they were careful. But it was also a dead end. One way in meant one way out, as Margaret tended to Samuel, washing trail dirt from his face with warm spring water. Dakota climbed to a vantage point. Through a gap in the rocks, he could see back down the canyon they'd traveled. Smoke rose in the distance, cook fires, probably. The hunters were making camp, resting before the final push. When he returned, Margaret was waiting. Samuel slept on a bed of pine boughs, exhausted from their flight. She'd washed her own face and tried to repair her tattered dress, and in the morning light, Dakota was struck again by her beauty, not the pampered prettiness of her former life, but something deeper, forged in trial and tenderness. "They're coming," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she nodded, accepting this with the same grace she'd shown throughout their ordeal. "Then we make our stand here." "Margaret?" "No." She stood, moving close to him. "I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid. They want those papers? They want to destroy us for knowing the truth. Then let them come." Her fierce pride stirred something primal in him. This woman who'd probably never held a gun before her husband's death was ready to fight trained killers. Not for the first time. Dakota wondered if the spirits had sent her to save him, rather than the other way around. "There's something else," Margaret said, her voice dropping. "Something I need to tell you, in case." She glanced at Samuel's sleeping form. "The papers aren't just evidence of embezzlement. Thomas found something bigger. The mining company has been selling information to foreign interests. Maps of mineral deposits, military patrol routes, things that could hurt a lot of people if they fell into the wrong hands." Dakota felt the weight of this settle on his shoulders. No wonder they were so determined to silence her. This went beyond local corruption to something that threatened the entire territory. "Where are they really hidden?" he asked. Margaret smiled sadly. "I sewed them into Samuel's jacket lining. A mother's instinct, I suppose. Keep the most precious things close to your heart." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The boy they sought to protect carried the very thing that put him in danger. They spent the day preparing. Dakota showed Margaret how to load and fire his rifle, how to find cover, how to breathe through fear. He set snares along the canyon approach, gathered what ammunition they had, filled containers with hot spring water. Margaret tore her petticoats into bandages, organized their supplies, and maintained a calm facade for Samuel's sake. As the sun began to sink, Dakota pulled Margaret aside. "There's a path," he said quietly. "Behind the ruins. It leads up to the cliff top. It's dangerous, especially with a child, but possible. When they come, we're not separating," Margaret interrupted. "Whatever happens, we face it together." "Margaret, be practical. Samuel needs—" She silenced him with a kiss, fierce and desperate. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I lost one man I loved to these vultures. I won't lose another. We stand together or not at all." Dakota wanted to argue, but he saw the futility of it. This woman who'd once embroidered samplers in a Baltimore drawing room had become a warrior in her own right. Who was he to deny her that choice? As darkness fell, they took their positions. Margaret and Samuel sheltered in the ruins while Dakota positioned himself among the rocks near the canyon entrance. The hot spring steam created an eerie mist, turning the valley into something from a dream, or a nightmare. The dogs arrived first, their baying echoing off the stone walls. Then came the lights, torches bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. Dakota counted at least a dozen men, maybe more. Hartley had returned with a small army. A voice called out, magnified by the canyon walls. "Mrs. Connor, we know you're in there. Come out peacefully, and we guarantee safe passage for you and the boy. It's the Apache we want." Margaret's response rang clear. "Go to hell." Dakota smiled grimly. His warrior woman. The first wave came at midnight, men creeping forward, trying to use the darkness and mist as cover. Dakota let them come. waiting until they hit his snares. Screams echoed as men fell into hidden pits. As rocks gave way beneath their feet, his rifle cracked, picking off shadows, using his knowledge of every boulder and crevice. But there were too many, and they kept coming. Soon he was falling back, leading them deeper into the valley, away from the ruins where Margaret and Samuel hid. He could hear Hartley shouting orders, trying to organize his panicked men. Then disaster. A lucky shot caught Dakota in the shoulder, spinning him around. He went down hard, rifle flying from his hands. As he struggled to rise, he saw them closing in, dark shapes against the mist. A shot rang out from the ruins, then another. Margaret had emerged, the pistol steady in her hands, picking off men with surprising accuracy. "Get away from him!" she screamed, transformed into something primal and fierce. The tide turned, confusion reigning as the hunters found themselves caught between two fires. Dakota retrieved his rifle, despite the burning pain in his shoulder, and together they held the entrance, making every shot count. But ammunition wouldn't last forever, and both of them knew it. As dawn approached, Dakota made a decision. He grabbed a torch from a fallen hunter and held it high. "Hartley," he called. "You want to know where the papers are? They're here, with us. Come and take them, if you can. But know this, I've rigged the whole valley with explosives from the old mine shafts. One wrong move, and we all go to the spirit world together." It was a bluff. But in the uncertain light, with the mist swirling and the evidence of his traps all around, it was believable. The attacking men hesitated, looking to their leader. Hartley emerged from cover, his face a mask of rage and calculation. "You're lying, savage." "Am I?" Dakota smiled coldly. "Your employers must want those papers badly. Are you willing to bet they'll forgive you for letting them be destroyed?" The standoff stretched taut. Then, from the canyon entrance, came the sound of horses, many horses, and a voice of authority. "This is Deputy U.S. Marshal Coleman. Everyone drop your weapons." The valley erupted in chaos. Hartley's men, caught between Dakota's position and the arriving marshals, scattered like quail before a hawk. Some tried to flee deeper into the valley. Others attempted to rush past the lawmen. Gunfire crackled in the dawn air, echoing off the canyon walls until it sounded like a full battle. Deputy Marshal Coleman, a lean man with steel-gray eyes and a face carved by years of frontier justice, rode at the head of a dozen men. They moved with military precision, cutting off escape routes and methodically disarming Hartley's hired guns. Within minutes, what had been a siege became a rout. Dakota kept his rifle trained on Hartley, who stood frozen between choices, his face cycling through rage, disbelief, and calculation. Margaret emerged from the ruins. Samuel clutched against her side, the pistol still steady in her free hand. "Mrs. Connor?" Marshal Coleman dismounted, approaching carefully with his hands visible. "I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Coleman. Your telegram reached us." Dakota glanced at Margaret in surprise. She met his gaze with a small, tired smile. "I sent word from the last trading post," she explained quietly. "Before the wagon, before everything, I hoped someone would come. But I didn't think. Took us a while to find you," Coleman continued. "When we heard about the wagon fire and your disappearance, we feared the worst. Then reports came in about armed men heading into the mountains. We've been tracking them for 2 days." Hartley finally found his voice. "Marshal, this woman is harboring a savage who—" "Save it," Coleman cut him off. "We know all about the mining company's schemes. Mr. Hartley, we've been investigating them for months. Mrs. Connor's evidence will just seal the case." As Coleman's men rounded up the survivors, Dakota felt the adrenaline drain from his body. The shoulder wound, ignored in the heat of battle, now screamed for attention. He swayed, and Margaret was there, supporting him, her face etched with concern. "He needs a doctor," she told Coleman. The marshal studied Dakota with professional interest. "You're the one they call the ghost of the high country. We've heard stories." Dakota tensed, but Coleman raised a placating hand. "Relax. As far as I'm concerned, you're a man who defended a woman and child from hired killers. Nothing more." Nothing less. They set up a temporary camp in the valley while Coleman's men secured the prisoners and tended the wounded. An army medic, traveling with the marshals, cleaned and bandaged Dakota's shoulder. The bullet had passed through cleanly, painful but not fatal. As the medic worked, Coleman interviewed Margaret, taking her statement and carefully collecting the papers from Samuel's jacket. The boy, resilient as only children could be, had already befriended one of the younger deputies and was pestering him about his badge and gun. "These documents," Coleman said, whistling low as he scanned them. "This goes all the way to Washington. There are going to be some very nervous men in very high places when this comes to light." "My husband died for those papers," Margaret said quietly. "His death won't be in vain, ma'am. You have my word on that." As the sun climbed higher, warming the valley and burning off the mist, Dakota found himself at a crossroads once more. The immediate danger had passed. But what came next? Margaret and Samuel were safe now, under federal protection. They could return to civilization, perhaps even go back east where she had family. Despite the estrangement, they no longer needed a broken Apache warrior with more ghosts than future. He was contemplating slipping away when Margaret found him by the hot spring, staring into the steaming water. "Don't even think about it," she said, settling beside him with a rustle of torn skirts. "Think about what?" "Disappearing, vanishing back into your mountains like smoke." She took his hand, careful of his bandaged shoulder. "I know that look. Dakota. It's the same one I had when Thomas died, the look of someone preparing to run from happiness because they think they don't deserve it. You're safe now. You don't need... Stop." She turned his face toward hers, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I don't need you. Samuel doesn't need you. After everything we've been through, you think this was just about survival? You could have a real life now. Go back east, start over. Samuel could go to proper schools, have opportunities. Samuel already has what he needs." Margaret interrupted. "A man who teaches him courage and kindness, who shows him that strength isn't about violence, but about protecting those you love, who gave him hope when we had none." Her voice softened. "Who gave me hope when I thought I'd never feel anything but grief again." Dakota wanted to argue, to list all the reasons why a match between them was impossible. The color of his skin, the weight of his past, the judgment of society. But looking into Margaret's eyes, seeing the fierce determination there, he realized she'd already considered all of that and chosen him anyway. "The marshal says there will be a trial," she continued. "In Denver, I'll need to testify. It could take months. After that," she squeezed his hand. "After that, we could go anywhere. California, maybe, or Oregon. Somewhere we could just be a family, without the past haunting every step. And if the past follows us, then we face it together." She smiled, sad and beautiful. "I'm tired of being afraid. Dakota, tired of letting what others think dictate how I live. I choose love. I choose you, if you'll have us." Before he could respond, Samuel came running, Deputy Coleman following at a more sedate pace. The boy threw himself at Dakota, mindful of the injured shoulder but still enthusiastic. "Deputy Coleman says we might get a reward," Samuel announced, "for helping catch the bad men. He says it could be enough to buy land somewhere. Can we get horses? And maybe some cows? I've always wanted to learn to ride like you do." Coleman cleared his throat. "Mrs. Connor, if I could have a word?" Margaret rose, but Coleman gestured for Dakota to remain. "This concerns you both. The federal prosecutor is prepared to offer a deal. Your testimony, Mrs. Connor, in exchange for complete immunity and, yes, a substantial reward from recovered assets. Enough to start fresh wherever you choose." "And Dakota?" Margaret asked. Coleman studied the Apache warrior. "Officially, I never saw him. My report will state that Mrs. Connor and her son were sheltering in an abandoned dwelling when we arrived. How they survived, who might have helped them, well, that's not relevant to the case." He paused. "However, unofficially, I might suggest that a man with his skills could find good work in the territories. Plenty of ranchers need experienced hands. And the army sometimes hires scouts. Papers can be arranged, new starts made. Dakota understood what wasn't being said. A chance to exist in the white world. To walk in daylight instead of shadows. To be a man with a future instead of a ghost with only a past. "I need time to think," he said. Coleman nodded. "We'll camp here tonight. Head out in the morning. Whatever you decide, know that you've done a good thing here. Those men won't hurt anyone else. Thanks to you both." As the marshal walked away, Margaret retook her seat beside Dakota. Samuel had wandered to the hot spring's edge, throwing pebbles and watching the ripples. The valley, which had nearly been their tomb, now seemed peaceful, almost blessed. The ancient ruins stood witness to other lives, other choices made in times of change. "Your family," Dakota said quietly. "Mourning Dove and my boys. They're always with me. They always will be." Margaret nodded. "As Thomas is with me, but I don't think they'd want us to stop living. Love isn't finite. Dakota, the heart expands. What we had with them doesn't diminish what we could have together. It honors it." A wind picked up, rustling through the canyon with a sound like whispers. Dakota closed his eyes, listening. For 3 years, he'd heard only sorrow in the wind's voice. Now, for the first time, he heard something else. Permission, perhaps, or blessing. When he opened his eyes, Margaret was watching him, patient and hopeful. Behind her, Samuel had given up on pebbles and was trying to catch the mist rising from the spring, laughing as it slipped through his fingers. "California sounds nice," Dakota said finally. "I hear they have mountains there too." Margaret's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. She kissed him then, there by the ancient spring, while their adopted son played and federal marshals secured the peace they'd fought so hard to win. It wasn't the ending to his story that Dakota had imagined when he'd made his oath of solitude, but perhaps that was the point. Life, unlike death, was full of surprises. As they sat together, planning a future neither had dared dream possible, Dakota felt the last chains of his oath finally break. He would always carry his dead with him, always honor their memory. But he would also live, fully and freely, with this remarkable woman who'd kissed his Apache soul back to life and the brave boy who called him Papa. The sun climbed toward noon, bathing the hidden valley in golden light. Somewhere in the ruins, a bird began to sing, its melody echoing off ancient stones that had seen so many endings and beginnings. And Dakota, no longer alone, no longer a ghost, added his own voice to the song of continuation, of hope, of love that conquers even the deepest sorrow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new roads to travel. But today, in this sacred place, 3 souls who had found each other against all odds sat together and knew peace. The morning of their departure dawned crisp and clear, painting the hidden valley in shades of amber and rose. Dakota stood at the entrance to the ancient ruins one last time, offering a silent prayer of gratitude to the old ones who had provided sanctuary in their hour of greatest need. The hot spring steamed gently in the cool air, and somewhere, high above, an eagle circled, its cry echoing off the canyon walls like a benediction. Margaret emerged from their temporary shelter, Samuel's hand in hers, both dressed in the new clothes Marshal Coleman's men had provided. The boy wore proper frontier gear now, sturdy boots, canvas pants, a jacket that fit, but pinned to his chest, bright as a star, was a small piece of turquoise Dakota had found in the ruins and shaped into a crude pendant, a protection charm. He'd told the boy, though in truth it was more than that. It was acceptance, adoption, a visible sign that Samuel belonged to 2 worlds now. "Are you ready?" Margaret asked softly, reading the emotion in Dakota's face. He nodded, shouldering the pack that contained their few possessions. Among them, wrapped carefully in deerskin, was Mourning Dove's blanket. He would carry it with him into their new life, not as a chain to the past, but as a bridge between what was and what would be. Marshal Coleman's party waited in the main canyon, horses saddled and ready. The captured men, including Hartley, sat shackled in a prison wagon. their faces sullen with defeat. Dakota felt no satisfaction at their fate, only a weary relief that this particular threat had passed. "I've arranged everything," Coleman told them as they prepared to mount. "There's a judge in Denver who'll handle your case quietly. Mrs. Connor, your testimony will be taken in private chambers, and the documents will be transferred to federal prosecutors. Should take no more than 2 months." "And after?" Margaret asked. Coleman smiled. "After that, you're free to go wherever you please. The reward money will be waiting in a Denver bank, enough to buy a small ranch or start a business." He glanced at Dakota. "I've also taken the liberty of preparing some papers. As far as anyone needs to know, you're Thomas O'Brien, originally from the Cherokee Nation, served as a scout for the Army. It's close enough to truth to pass scrutiny, but different enough to give you a fresh start." Dakota accepted the forged documents with mixed feelings. To take another name felt like a betrayal. Yet he understood the necessity. In the white man's world, papers mattered more than truth. And these papers would allow him to marry Margaret legally, to be Samuel's father in the eyes of the law. "Thank you," he said simply. The journey down from the mountains took 3 days. They traveled slowly, mindful of the wounded among Coleman's men and the treacherous paths made slick by melting snow. Samuel rode with Dakota, chattering excitedly about everything they passed, every bird, every track, every distant peak. The boy had an insatiable curiosity that reminded Dakota painfully of his own sons. Yet the pain was softer now, tempered by the promise of future rather than the weight of loss. Margaret rode beside them, her back straight despite her exhaustion, her eyes constantly moving between her 2 men, for that's what they'd become. Dakota realized, her men, her family. When she caught him looking, she smiled. And in that smile was everything: gratitude, love, hope, and a fierce determination to make this improbable union work. On the second night, camped by a clear mountain stream, Coleman approached Dakota by the fire. "I've been a lawman for 15 years, the marshal said, settling onto a log with a grunt. "Seen a lot of situations that don't fit neatly into right and wrong. This is one of them." Dakota waited, sensing more was coming. "The world's changing," Coleman continued. "The frontier's closing, civilizations meeting and clashing. Men like Hartley, they represent the worst of it, greed dressed up as progress. But what you and Mrs. Connor have found, that might just represent the best, love that doesn't see color or past, just possibility. It won't be easy." Dakota said, "Nothing worth doing ever is." Coleman pulled out a pipe, packing it thoughtfully. "California might be your best bet. Lots of mixed families there, Mexican, Indian, Chinese, white, in a place where everyone's from somewhere else. Being different isn't quite as remarkable." They spoke little after that, but Dakota felt an unexpected kinship with the gruff lawman. Here was another man trying to navigate the collision of worlds with some semblance of honor intact. Denver, when they reached it, was overwhelming. Buildings crowded together like teeth, the air thick with coal smoke and the scent of too many people in too small a space. Samuel clung to Dakota's hand, eyes wide at the wonders and terrors of civilization. Margaret walked with her chin high, but Dakota could feel her tension as people stared at their unlikely trio. Coleman had arranged rooms at a respectable boarding house run by a widow who asked no questions. For the first time since the wagon fire, they slept in real beds, ate at a proper table, bathed in hot water that didn't smell of sulfur. It should have felt like luxury, but Dakota found himself missing the simplicity of his lodge, the clean air of the mountains, the silence broken only by wind and wildlife. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed. Margaret testified behind closed doors, her voice steady as she recounted her husband's discovery, his death, their flight and pursuit. The documents were authenticated, copies made, originals sealed away as evidence. Dakota wasn't called to testify, officially. He didn't exist in this narrative, but he waited in the courthouse halls, a silent guardian, ready to act if danger appeared. It was there, sitting on a hard bench while justice ground its slow wheels, that Samuel asked the question Dakota had been dreading. Why do people stare at us? Dakota looked down at the boy's earnest face, searching for words. Before he could speak, Margaret appeared from the judge's chambers, her business concluded. She'd heard the question, and her eyes met Dakota's with shared understanding. "They stare," she said, kneeling before her son. "Because we're unusual, because we're a family made by choice rather than blood, by love rather than convention, and that makes some people uncomfortable." "Is it wrong?" Samuel asked in a small voice. "No, my darling, love is never wrong. Small minds and hard hearts are wrong. Fear and hatred are wrong. But love is the most right thing in the world." That night, in their boarding house room, as Samuel slept between them like a small, trusting bridge, Margaret whispered, "I meant every word." "You know that, don't you?" "I know," Dakota replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "But knowing and living it, those are different things. There will be hard days ahead. Then we'll face them together." She laced her fingers through his. "I've been thinking about California, a small ranch, maybe near the coast. Samuel could go to school. You could raise horses. I've seen how they respond to you. I could take in sewing or keep books for local businesses. It wouldn't be grand, but it would be ours." "It sounds perfect," he said, and meant it. 2 weeks later, they stood on the platform at Denver's train station, waiting to board the westbound locomotive that would carry them to their new life. The reward money was safely deposited, their few belongings loaded, their tickets purchased under their new names, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas O'Brien and Son. As the train whistle shrieked and steam billowed around them, Dakota felt a moment of vertigo. 3 months ago, he'd been a ghost haunting the high country, sworn to solitude forever. Now he was a husband, a father, a man with documents that said he belonged in this clamoring world of iron and steam. Samuel tugged at his hand. "Papa, the train! Papa!" The word still caught him by surprise, piercing his heart with its simple trust. He lifted the boy onto his shoulders, feeling the small hands grip his hair for balance, and followed Margaret onto the train. As they settled into their seats, the whistle blew again, and the great machine lurched into motion. Denver fell away, then the foothills, then the last glimpse of the mountains that had been Dakota's world. Ahead lay the vast plains, the desert, the distant ocean, and somewhere among it all, a place where they could simply be. Margaret leaned against his shoulder. Samuel pressed between them, already drowsing to the rhythm of the rails. Outside the window, the landscape blurred past, each mile taking them further from their separate pasts and closer to their shared future. "No regrets?" Margaret asked softly. Dakota thought of his oath, sworn in blood and grief beneath unforgiving stars. He thought of Mourning Dove and their children, forever part of him but no longer a weight to drown him. He thought of the lodge in the mountains, empty now except for memories and wind. Then he looked at the woman beside him, fierce and gentle in equal measure, and the boy who'd claimed him as surely as any blood son could. "No regrets," he said, and for the first time in 3 years, meant it completely. The train carried them west, into the setting sun, into uncertainty and hope, and the promise of a love that had set his Apache soul on fire and brought him back to life. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal, holding their secrets. Ahead, California waited with its own challenges and possibilities. But for now, in this moment suspended between past and future, Dakota allowed himself to simply be a man who had lost everything, found love in the most unexpected place, and discovered that sometimes the end of one story is really just the beginning of another. As night fell and stars appeared in the darkening sky, he held his family close and whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever spirits had guided their paths together. The widow's kiss had indeed set his soul on fire, not the destructive flame of loss and rage, but the warm, steady glow of love renewed, of life reclaimed, of hope restored. The train rolled on through the darkness, carrying 3 souls toward a dawn they would greet together. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope it touched your heart as much as it did mine. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect across the miles. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more tales of love, adventure, and redemption in the American frontier. What did you think of Dakota and Margaret's journey? Share your thoughts below. I read every comment.